You're ready to try stranded knitting. All you need is a set of needles and 2 contrasting colors of yarn in the same weight. Colorwork is intended to be knit in rounds. I am just do it in rows because it gets to be a very big swatch if you're trying to do it in rounds, but I recommend starting with a cowl or something similar so you can just get really familiar with it over time. So I worked up a couple rows just because that's going to make life a little bit easier. We're first going to start with just a simple row of every other stitch just to get that practiced. And you might want to try this for a few rows or ideally rounds. I'm going to first show you, like I said, in 1 by 1, and then I will show you some tips and tricks on how to do it in an actual stitch pattern. So let's get going. You're going to start by leaving 6 to 8 inches of a tail to weave in ends. The easiest and quickest way to do stranded knitting is to have one strand over each finger. So you will have your main color, the one that you're knitting with the most, over your dominant form of tensioning. For me, that's going to be on my left hand because I'm a continental knitter. And then I'm going to have my non-dominant hand with my contrast color. So to get it hooked in, though, I'll start with kind of a little bit extra help. And then I will get my hands all set. So you simply knit one off your left hand, knit one off your right hand. Now this can take, honestly, a lot of getting used to. It took me a few projects before I really felt comfortable switching hands. And try a few different methods for knitting. If you're new to continental, look at a bunch of different videos and kind of see some different methods. Same for English or flicking. Depending on how I'm feeling that day, since it's my non-dominant, sometimes I throw, sometimes I flick. It's just kind of whatever feels naturally that day. You do want to try to stick to one method for an entire project just so that it is even. And the biggest thing you want to keep in mind as you're getting a little bit more comfortable with those fingers is to leave a lot of space between stitches. So if you notice, I'm kind of holding my needles pretty open, which is giving more space between stitches for these floats in the back to cross and remain loose. If you keep your stitches too tight together, then you are very likely going to have really tight floats in the back. And floats are what these little bits of yarn that are floating, hanging out in the back on the non-knit stitches. And that is your biggest thing that you want to try to do, is keep those floats nice and loose. But as we are working flat, I will also show you some tips for if you want to swatch flat, because like I said before, it does make for a very large swatch. What I'm going to start with is I added 8 stitches, 4 on each side of the 2 repeats of the pattern that I'm going to be doing. And this is allowing me to do a little checked pattern that I will do, split stitch, that I will do every other stitch. And on the next round, I will swap that so that it will be light, dark, light, dark. And I'll just keep that going in a checked pattern up the side on both sides. And that gives the stitches somewhere to start, because as you'll see, they'll get very uneven as you're leaving a trail of yarn behind the back. I'll show you how to do that in a moment. But let's go ahead and then begin with the pattern. I have 1 stitch to start it, and then I will have 4 light stitches. And then I'm going to tug those stitches all the way open as far as they can go, before making my next dark stitch. I'm making 3 dark stitches before opening those up all the way and making the 4 light. Now, the reason why we open these all the way, to keep these floats in the back nice and loose. The reason why we want these so loose is if you were to keep these stitches all bunched up, say, as we normally would, and begin knitting, everything nice and tight and close to the tip, you then are not allowing these stitches enough space when it's all tight in the back to fully open up when you release that fabric. And in doing so, it's going to pull from the back and create this puckering effect. That's why it's important to keep all of these floats nice and loose so that those stitches have some place to settle. I've chosen a pattern that's going to change it up a little bit, many of the rows, so that I can show you a few different techniques. Again, I'm just going to keep stretching that out no matter what row I'm doing, no matter what I'm doing, just keep those floats in the back nice and loose, always stretched. I'm going to keep doing this all the way until we hit those last 4 stitches. And I'll show you what to do if you're wanting to work a swatch flat. So I'm gonna, those last 4 stitches, dark, light, dark, exactly like I'd done, and ending with that light stitch. And then, get this down so you can see the whole thing. I'm going to slide my circular needles all the way to the other side and begin again. I'm not going to bunch it up quite yet. I'm going to keep this all nice and loose in the back. And this time, for each of these first 2 stitches, I usually do, see I've got it a little bit loose. I pinned it down in the back just below to keep it nice and loose. I get that stitch to get this yarn locked on, which can sometimes be a little bit tricky because it's just hanging loose in the back, which is not how we're used to knitting. So I get that one locked on, and then I pick up this other one, and again, make sure that it is nice and loose along the back and get it locked into that opposite color stitch. And I could feel it tighten up as I did it, so I'm going to pull a little bit more. This is going to make for some really wonky edge stitches. That is normal. So after I get those first 2 settled, that's when I get my yarn settled back into the correct position and get all 4 stitches set up for the next row. So for this one, I start with 3 dark stitches, 3 light stitches, 1 dark stitch, 3 light stitches. For pretty much all color work, you are going to be working from a chart. It's a really easy grid. It makes it very easy to see what your next stitches are and how it all should look. Now, I'm going to show you how to catch a float because this next one is 7 stitches wide. With 7 stitches, this is pretty easy because you want to catch it so that there are 3 stitches on one side and 4 stitches on the other. So now that I've worked 3 stitches, what I'm going to do is bring this up and take my dark yarn around the back. This effectively catches this yarn And it means that we're not going to have a 7-stitch long float hanging along the back. You don't want this for several reasons. It gets really easy to get caught on, pulled on, and then you can really mess up your stitches when you don't catch your floats. It also makes it much more likely that your stitches are going to pucker and that you will have trouble later on down the road. So don't worry, I will show you how to catch a float again, and I will show you a few other methods as well. 1 stitch, and just all the time keeping those stitches pulled nice and open. So you'll see that these end stitches are going to get a little wonky because there's just a lot of loose yarn along this back side, and that'll continue going, lots and lots of loose yarn along the back. But I just kind of try to keep them a little bit pulled neat. It makes it a little bit easier at the end. And then I just pull that needle through to begin the next row. Again, I'm going to pull those from this end nice and loose. And again, I'm making that checkerboard pattern over here. So if I've started with a light stitch on the last one, I'm going to start with a dark stitch on this one. Get that one started. Make sure it's nice and loose. Get the light stitch started, also making sure it's nice and loose. All right, I've got those first 2 stitches started and everything in the right hand, right finger, and I'm going to start my 3rd row. So for this 3rd row, I start with 4 dark stitches. And then I will have 5 light stitches. Now 5 is one of those interesting numbers. You can choose to catch your float or not to choose to catch your float. I am going to, because I've had enough of these catch on things that the floats can catch on your ring or on anything sticking out at all. And it's a little bit heartbreaking. So I'm going to go ahead and catch. This is another method to catch your float. You lay it over the top and then simply knit the next stitch. And that makes a beautiful little lock right here. This is probably my favorite locking method, but it is better for locking the yarn that is in your right hand. So you still want to tug it open, keep those nice and loose, getting that resituated on my right hand. And then I am knitting 9 stitches. So with 9 stitches, I'm going to want to lock it twice. So I start with 3 stitches, and then I'm going to bring that up, and my working yarn around. I've found, honestly, that it's best to be a little bit fluid. Some people are very structured in where they keep their yarn. Mine tends to kind of move around a little bit, and you'll have to experiment with what is easiest for you. So now I'm going to just lay that back over the top, and look at that. They're back in the hands that they were supposed to be in. So I'm going to finish those last 3 stitches, pulling all of that wide and open again as usual. This is 5 stitches in light, so I'm going to lay that over to lock it, and just keeping it down there until I hit the end of those 5 stitches, and then I release it to go back to my right hand. And some people would get that set right back over there. Again, you'll find what is most comfortable for you. So this is 5 stitches long, so I am going to go ahead and lock it. pulling that up and over. And in doing so, I chose to switch this yarn to my left hand. You can do that. You don't have to. You can just keep going and switch them all the way. Either way is totally fine. And then I'm doing those last 4 stitches. And again, those float edges get really crazy. I find just giving them a little bit of a tug helps keep it from getting too unruly later down the road. I've skipped ahead so you can start to see the pattern forming, but also because this is a great row to show you how to lock floats kind of over and over. So this is 7 stitches, so I'm going to divide it into 3 and 4. You can lay over the top like so, and just keep knitting. Now, some would immediately pull this back over the next stitch. I'm not going to do that because when you do that, it essentially locks the stitch on either side of the float. And the reason why I don't want to do this is because you never want to lock the stitch in the same place. When you start to do, if you start to lock in the same spot, row after row, you're going to see it between the stitches. And that's not something that you want. So I like to do as few locks as I can get away with so that I have to manage that less on the back end. So then when I get to the end of my light color stitches, I simply swap it over the top and begin knitting. This is also a 7 stitch. So when I'm beginning with this yarn from underneath, I just switch that over so that it is getting locked here. And I keep going. Now there are certainly more efficient ways to lock, but this has a really natural flow for me that I have just grown to love. So try out some different methods of float locking to see what works for you. So when I got to the end of those dark colored stitches, I pull them open, switch the yarn back to how I had it, and knit 3, pull it over to lock, always keeping those open and wide. I get to the end of my row, into my checkerboard stitches to keep everything locked and where it's supposed to be. So you can see that checkerboard pattern forming, but it's very loose and wonky on the end, and that's because you've got all this here along the back just hanging out and loose. The other reason why I like to just keep them all loose like this, I've seen some really neat, beautiful, tight little ones on the back that you've, maybe knit on a 7-inch circular or something of that nature. This way, I'm not cutting any yarn. So if I do want to reuse it for anything, that option is still open to me. For somebody who likes to steek, and please check out our steeking video, I'm quite averse to cutting yarn more than I have to. Yeah, make sure you're not knitting with those super long floats on the back. It would be easy to do. So now I have 9 stitches. So I'm going to do 3, 3, and 3. So lock, I'm going to leave it in that position. And this is nice when you're having to do multiple floats, because then when I came to the next place where I want to trap that float, I simply set it back into its neutral position. and now it's double locked. Pull it open. This is especially important when you've got those long floats because it would be really easy to pucker it. This is only 5 stitches, so I'm just going to do 2, and I'll finish that row out. And now I'm just going to let you watch for a while. I'm going to go on super speed. Feel free on YouTube, you can slow it down by using the settings and watch it at regular or close to regular speed. I'm just going to let you kind of watch so you can get the hang of it. Once I finished the pattern and then knitted a purl row above, I took the time to go back and pull each of those floats so that it tightens up those edge stitches, but it also makes sure that the floats behind are nice and loose. This is important when you're blocking so that you can actually lay it flat and get a true sense of what your gauge is going to be. If you're going to be knitting for a while longer, like I was, I chose to put some clips on the edge. These are just hair clips that I grabbed out of my dresser, and this just helps secure those floats in place. Your other option is just to wait to pull all of those tight until you're done knitting. And here's our swatch fresh off the blocking mats. You'll see that the tension is nice and even. You cannot see any floats sticking out from where we have caught them in these longer rows. And it's just going to be a great way to be able to get your gauge, and also is a lovely practice. You'll see also that these edge stitches are a little uneven and that this center here is a little bit more puffy than this end. And that's simply because we have all of these floats running across the back. Some of them are a little bit looser, some of them are a little bit tighter, which is why we got that unevenness here. But all in all, they are all loose enough that we're not puckering our fabric, which means that we're going to be able to get great gauge here in the front, or simply practice. And thank you for joining us for this tutorial. Please visit us to find many more tutorials, and we hope you enjoy.